Listen to the ground. It holds streets you cannot see, homes that warmed families through winters, plazas that shook with song. 1,000 years ago, before iron bells crossed the sea, a wooden skyline rose from this river valley. Timber walls thudded into soil, fires painted ceilings with soot copper, flashed on dancers as night fell. What remains is a soft swell under grass and a curve of ditch hidden by weeds. Yet when instruments hum and maps bloom, an entire city returns like a photograph in a tray. Markets clatter again. Children race along packed earth. Leaders argue in council houses big enough to swallow barn. We have been taught to look east for civilization, to mark history by sails and crosses. The continent whispers another chronology. If you listen now, you will hear a heartbeat older than the ships. It is still beating. The first map is a frost line on a hill. It traces the warmth of buried wood and the chill of untouched clay. From that line we draw a circle, then a square, then a road that slips between both like a needle through cloth. People gathered here in numbers that bend the imagination. Not scattered hamlets, but neighborhoods, avenues, courtyards alive with barter and feasts. Timber walls held back ambition and fear alike. Drums called councils, while watchfires braided smoke with the stars. The soil remembers where bodies rested and where games thundered. We push a sled across grass and a town of shadows rises on the screen. Every rectangle is a roofline. Every dark band a trench for posts heavier than men. The city is not gone. It is only quiet, and our instruments are learning to speak softly enough to hear it again. Communities do not appear by accident. They plan themselves into being through ritual and repetition. Here, the plaza taught time. The sun walked the perimeter and marked seasons on the corners. Markets opened with grain and closed with stories. Children learned to run between posts, to count with footsteps, to measure trust by how far a neighbor would carry a bundle. Power had an address. Songs rehearsed law. When droughts came, decisions were argued where the wind could hear them. When floods swelled, the same hands that stacked baskets also stacked earth. A city built from wood and soil is not fragile. It is responsive. It breathes. It composts and renews. What fails to last in stone survives in rhythm. We follow those rhythms across counties and centuries, threading from one low rise to the next like beads on a long strand. The river birthed this city and carried its name outward. Canoes slid from muddy banks at dawn, hulls slick with bear fat, loaded with shell, copper, salt, and stories. Upstream, a cousin city, answered with its own plaza and its own drums. Networks laced the continent in braided channels of trade and kinship. The roads we find in soil were mirrored by roads on water, smooth and ancient. A copper plate crossed 300 miles and changed hands at a wedding. A bundle of chert blades paid for a feast. Cacao passed from warm forests to cold kitchens, and tasted like thunderclouds. The river taught exchange, patience, and humility before flood and ice. When we hold an artifact, we hold a handshake, the warmth of a bargain struck, the promise to meet again when the moon returns to this shape. Memory is a climate. It can warm a place until seeds sprout again, or it can freeze a field so hard that even stories crack. For generations, these towns were mislabeled, misunderstood, or erased by disbelief. The ground was called simple when it was in fact engineered. The builders were called wanderers when they were citizens. The mounds were dismissed as accidents of nature or fantasies of strangers. Yet each scan, each shard, each song hidden in a family prayer thaws another layer. The people who lived here needed no validation from distant empires. They organized, they argued, they fell in love, they mourned, they governed, they dreamed. We cannot return their voices, but we can offer listening. If we tune ourselves to the pitch of this soil, we will hear what they left for us, plans for a city made of care. Stone remembers with a sharper edge than soil. The canyon opens like a book of stacked pages, and each wall carries the imprint of a city that stitched itself to the horizon. Rooms multiplied with a mason's patience, corners true to the path of the sun, doorways lining up so that light could pass from one to the next like a messenger. Roads leave the canyon in straight lines that ignore gullies and rock, insisting on purpose over convenience. They were not simple trails but engineered corridors, leveled and flanked by berms, places where feet rehearsed ceremony as miles unspooled beneath them. The heart of this system beat in plazas that held dances and debates, in storerooms that smelled of maize and smoke, in kivas where breath descended through ladders into cool earth. When night fell, the canyon roof filled with stars, and the city kept time with them. A choreography of stone and sky. Time here was a living companion that returned each season and asked the same questions. Builders studied it with care, reading solstice and equinox in the passage of light across carved slabs. A shaft of brightness would slip through a slit and kiss a spiral at noon, then withdraw like a tide. Shadows crossed markers with such precision that a single day's misstep would tell of a drifting calendar. The sky wrote its calendar on the walls and floors of rooms, on the lintels of doorways, on the rims of ceremonial chambers where people gathered to sing the year awake. This conversation with the heavens was not a luxury. It governed planting and harvest, travel and storage, pilgrimage and rest. To live well in this arid country meant to align intention with the path of the sun, to let stone and light hold counsel before a hand touched sea. Communication reached beyond the canyon walls through a lattice of overlooks and mesas that could see one another like neighbors across a vast street. Signals leapt from ridge to ridge, bright in daylight when mirrors caught the sun, alive at night when coals flared into flame. A message could run faster than a runner if hills were stationed with watchers and fuel. The roads on the ground met the roads in the air, and news moved with both. Drought warnings, festival invitations, trade arrivals, the simple assurance that kin were awake in the dark, all traveled this network. To build such a system required not only towers and sightlines, but agreements about meaning and rhythm, a grammar of flashes and pauses, a choreography of embers. Even the silence between signals mattered, proof that the perimeter held, and that morning would be shared. Water ruled everything. The people courted it with terraces and check dams, guided it with stone-lined channels, stored it in shallow reservoirs that captured brief storms. Fields stepped down arroyos like careful handwriting, each line spaced to slow a flood and feed a root. Decisions about planting were made with an ear tuned to thunder and a nose trained to the smell of wet dust. When skies withheld, leaders gathered not to command clouds but to marshal human patience. Granaries opened with ceremony. Routes to distant cousins reopened, bringing maize one season, salt the next. The architecture of survival was social as much as it was hydraulic. A city in the desert had to learn to breathe shallow, then deep, matching the pulse of a sky that could be generous or severe. The traces remain in stone lips along gullies and in the quiet gleam of varnished rock. Cliff homes gathered families into the shelter of stone, their walls tucked like swallows' nests beneath overhangs that faced the low winter sun. Ladders stitched movement between levels, while courtyards held grinding songs and the soft percussion of millstones. The city withdrew into height, learning to look down upon its fields and its roads. Stories grew to explain the decision, some speaking of pilgrimage, others of diplomacy, others of the patience required when seasons changed their habits. Here, sound traveled oddly, conversations sliding along the rock face and returning as whispers. Nights were cold and bright, mornings smelled of ash and juniper. From these ledges, people watched the same stars that ruled the canyon calendars, and they measured life against patterns that never tired. What seems like retreat was also design, an architecture that turned climate and geology into kin. The forest sounds like a river turned to leaves. Cicadas stitch the air, rain patters in distant curtains, and underfoot the soil smells of sweet rot and old fires. Above, a green ocean hides geometry. The machine's pulse rises and falls as a beam grazes branches and returns with the weight of cities. A lattice of straight lines takes shape where only trunks had been. Grids appear with plazas at their hearts. Canals spooling toward low hollows that once held water. Causeways joining hilltops like tightrope paths. The illusion of wildness loosens. This is a tended world, tended so patiently that the care became forest. Paths lie level beneath roots. Reservoirs rimmed with stone cradle lilies and memory. The canopy closes again. But the mind does not forget the map. Once seen, the ghost infrastructure sits over the leaves like a clear plate on a page. The jungle has been speaking in straight lines all along, and now the voice carries. Water once flowed here in a choreography of patience. Rains came in bursts and vanished into heat, so people taught the land to sip rather than gulp. Low dams curved across gullies with the grace of ribs. Basins were scoured clean and lined with clay, their edges planted with reeds that filtered silt. Channels bent around roots and shifted slope by hand. Span increments, the kind of precision that grows from generations who watch storm after storm. When the sun leaned hard, ponds retreated like eyes narrowing, but their bottoms stayed damp and generous. The smell of wet clay meant seed time. The sound of frogs meant a held promise. Fish and turtles shared their villages with maize and squash as if the plan were written into the mud itself. The forest answered not with surrender, but with partnership, letting human intention braid into its own wild weave. The road in the forest does not look like a road until the light finds it. It runs straight as a thought cutting through shade, leveled with fill, shouldered by low banks that once gleamed white. Along its length, neighborhoods faced inward, doors turning toward traffic that moved on bare feet and padded paws. Markets flowered where paths crossed, their scents rising into leaves. Cacao changed owners beside salt and cotton. Obsidian chipped on a mat where stories were traded as part of the price. The road was not only movement, it was agreement made visible, a line everyone respected, so that exchanges could keep their rhythm. To walk it now is to step from shadow to shadow, while birds offer commentary, and the ground holds its line with dignified stubbornness. In the imagination, footsteps multiply, and the forest becomes a city stretched thin. Fields float when ground learns to breathe. In the wet hollows beyond the roads, people stitched platforms from brush and mud, fed them with muck stirred from the canals, and laced their margins with willow and cane. Roots reached into water that never forgot the last storm. Maize speared up beside amaranth and chiles, while flowers pulled bees to the edges. Fish browsed the canal weeds and turned scraps into meat. The arrangement turned flood into engine, turning silt to harvest without exhausting the soil. Even where the forest seems untouchable, the pattern repeats in quieter forms, the slow construction of dark earth, rich with charcoal and bone. The proof is in a handful that smells like rain. It is power gathered one hearth at a time, spread across centuries until the land remembers how to feed itself well beyond the work of any one light. When the canopy closes and night walks out of the trees, the city is still there, only rewritten in sound. Frogs throb and insects ring. Somewhere, a jaguar coughs like a cracked drum. In the dark, courtyards remain in the arrangement of trunks, and reservoirs reveal themselves by the breath of cool air that slides over their skin. People once matched this pulse with songs that worked as tools. Grinding stones kept time with stories that taught how to choose a planting bed or mend a levee. Children learned by carrying water, by counting steps along a causeway, by tasting the first maize of a season while elders watched the sky. Engineering lived in the body before it lived in diagrams, and the forest preserved the memory in pathways that still feel right underfoot. The engines here were green and wet, powered by rain and attention, and 1,000 hands kept them turning. Across warm seas, the traffic of desire stitched islands to continents with cords of fiber. and faith. Canoes longer than houses slid from mangrove shade into turquoise corridors, their hulls oiled and sweet with resin, their cargo smelling of cacao, shell, salt fish, smoked turkey, copper that caught sun like a tame flame. Songs held roots in their verses, each reef a rhyme, in each headland a refrain. Trade did not travel as objects alone. It moved as obligations and invitations, as marriages promised with woven belts, as alliances sealed by cups of foamed chocolate. Storms tested memory and patience, yet the crossings persisted, teaching crews to read swell and cloud as carefully as a ledger. The archipelago became a marketplace without walls, a constellation of harbors where strangers greeted one another like cousins. In every bundle tied with fiber, there was a story folded small, ready to be opened with a paddle stilled. In the markets that skirted lagoons, voices braided like ropes. Shell tinkled on belts, cotton brushed wrists like cool water. Smoked salt glittered in shallow baskets, and the bitter bloom of cacao perfumed the shade. Values shifted with season and scarcity, but meanings held steady. A gorget with a dancer engraved could speak for a lineage. A twist of red dye could carry a coastline in its hue. Weighing happened in hands and eyes rather than on scales, trust doing the arithmetic more quickly than numbers. A boat's arrival might tilt the day toward celebration or caution, depending on whose prow cut the check. News traveled with goods, wove rumors into roots, and taught which ports to court, and which to avoid until moon and tide turned. The market was a chorus as much as a ledger, and the chorus remembered who kept their word. Far beyond the surf, trails climbed into mountains that build their own weather, cool breath spilling downslope to meet the sea's salt tongue. Copper left river-cut banks in baskets, obsidian rode on backs like captured night, cotton climbed in coils. Feathers rode with stories wrapped in them for luck. Passes demanded respect, and caravans learned to move like water, slow where gorge constricted, swift where valley opened. Rest houses stood at day's edge, where tobacco embers glowed and news was bartered for shelter. The climb did not sever the coast from the highlands, it braided them. Salt thickened stews deep in the cold, and gold dust brightened ceremonies by the mangroves. The line of exchange ran not as a single road, but as a braided river of paths, each strand ready to take the flow when another ran dry. Memory, again, kept the map. Gold traveled not as currency alone, but as sunlight captured for ceremony. It leafed masks that watched dancers become ancestors. It edged wooden plaques that told stories with gleam, where words could not crowd. Salt, by contrast, drew power from necessity, pressed into bricks, stacked in riverboats, marched inland like harvest you could taste. Together they made a grammar of need and wonder. A village that stored salt well became a winter's anchor. A shrine that flashed with hammered plates turned a pilgrimage path into a map of wonder. Between them walked sinew, the woven strength of cordage and kinship. Networks endured because relationships were tied and retied with gifts, with favors remembered, with songs that named who carried whom up which pass in which storm. The objects remain heavy or crystalline in the hand, but their true weight is the bond they represent. The web reached its widest when rivers, passes, and currents agreed, as seasons' brief truce making corridors out of hazards. Then fleets gathered and caravans lengthened, and the continent felt its own size shrink to fit the span of an agreement. News outran storms, and promises leapt from island to inlet to ridge town to basin city. It was not empire in the sense of a single will. It was choreography, 1,000 decisions made toward balance. When trouble came, the same threads could tighten into snares or slacken to let pressure slide away. What lingers in the ground is proof of practice. Repairable networks rather than brittle chains. To see the routes is to see a kind of hope. The knowledge that abundance can be organized without erasing difference, that a canoe and a caravan can speak to each other, and that memory still knows the crossings when maps forget. The river gathers worlds and sorts them by patience. Where its brown water slows, It lays down a floor of silt that can raise a city if hands agree to lift with it. Here, the ground swells into terraces and mounds, each face dressed to the compass, each summit trained for spectacle and decision. Houses lined avenues that rose toward platforms where voices carried across the floodplain like migrating geese. Smoke rings drifted from kitchens while runners crossed plazas with messages held tight. Palisades stood like tall reeds translated into timber, bending only to gates that knew the names of visitors. When rain hammered the roofs, the gutters sang. When the sun burned, packed clay shone like a polished drum. The river kept accounts in flood marks and drift lines, and the city answered with ditches, borrow pits turned ponds, and levees that walked beside the banks. The bargain was renewal, flood by flood, ceremony by ceremony, a rhythm that set the pulse for miles. Power lived in the height of platforms and the choreography of ascent. Leaders rose with the stairs and stepped into sight, framed by sky and banners. Below, the plaza concentrated breath and attention into a single surface where the public body learned itself. Announcements stitched harvest to ritual, marriage to treaty, mourning to law. A city of wood does not shout with longevity, but it speaks through repetition. Posts replaced posts in circles that reasserted memory, and floors were replastered until they glowed with the polish of countless feet. The boundaries between sacred and civic blurred along the plaza edges where storehouses faced council houses. Music, made it of rattles and drums, rolled against the palisade like surf. The echo fixed decisions in the mind so they could survive beyond the voice that carried them. The high places did not only elevate people, they lifted obligations into view. Games taught the rules that councils would later argue. Stone discs skated across packed clay as players paced beside them with spears of sight alone, choosing the instant to commit. The circle of spectators tightened and relaxed like a lung. Bets rode on honor and on stored corn, on the goodwill of a neighboring clan, on the possibility of a marriage waiting at the edge of the crowd. The field was not mere pastime. It rehearsed aim and restraint, the capacity to act in a breath and to hold back for hours. In the wake of each throw, lessons rippled outward. Children learned trajectories with their bodies long before geometry had a diagram. Traders watched faces rather than stones to measure future partners. Even failure returned as practice, preparing muscles and tempers for tomorrow's harder contests. In the dust of play, the city refined its sense of fairness. Beneath the plazas, the dead joined the city with a steadier presence than the living. Graves clustered with care, some near doorways, some beneath floors, some in precincts ringed by posts that read as sentences when seen from above. Offerings traveled down with them, shell that smelled of far coasts, copper that held a flicker of fire even in shade, pottery that cupped the echo of a last meal. Hierarchy took shape in the depth of pits, in the weight of ornaments, in the labor woven into wooden mantles and braided belts. Yet kinship braided rank with responsibility. The living renewed the compact with feasts that fed both memory and hunger. Smoke rose and stories carried names into seasons the body would never meet. In this way, the city stretched time, binding moments to ancestors and futures in a fabric dense enough to resist forgetting. Politics here traveled by gift and by grain, by the length of a feast table and the reach of a warning. Alliances braided along river bends where emissaries exchanged belts and promises beneath the gaze of wooden effigies. When danger tested the edges, watch platforms sent smoke up and measured pulses that bent on the wind and still reached the next town in time. The palisade was more than defense. It was a calendar of repairs and a school of shared labor. Boards loosened and were replaced, gates strengthened and repainted. Trenches dredged to drink a flood rather than drown in it. Authority rose and fell with the steadiness of this maintenance and with the fairness of distributions when harvests trembled. The river measured leaders by how well they listened to water and to people. Cities endured when listening kept pace with ambition, when the high speakers on the mounds learned to speak softly enough to be heard. Seasons slipped their patterns and would not be coaxed back. Rains arrived in fits that scoured terraces one month and forgot entire valleys the next. Reservoirs shrank to mirrors the size of a hand. Wind crossed the flats with a new hardness, lifting soil into a pale sky that tasted like pottery dust. People did what they always did first. They repaired. They replastered floors until the lime stung their throats, deepened ditches, raised walls, opened storerooms with ceremony and counted kernels twice. Fields crept to higher benches. Pilgrims traced old roads to ask cousins for seed. Songs changed tempo to match lean years, but trees do not lie, and the rings of dead beams tell of summers stacked thin as paper. At night, the city heard the complaint of empty ladders and the slow creak of timbers drying. Hope worked like a lever against a stone that would not move. When the day to leave finally came, it was not surrender, but triage. Footprints pointed to springs that still spoke, to soils that still held. The ground kept the plan in silence. Hunger seldom travels alone. Illness moved where people gathered to share help and news, riding breath in crowded rooms and following water when hands dipped the same jar. Fever took minutes and stretched them into hours that would not end. The remedies were the old ones first: steam and herbs, fasting and prayer, careful isolation of sleeping mats, the patient work of tending. Bodies weakened, then learned again or did not. Graves spread like pale sails along the edges of towns. The architecture changed its voice. Lighter roofs over emptier courtyards, storage rooms opened and left ajar. Ladders unused long enough for soot to settle. Not every place suffered at once. Villages that lucked into clean springs or quieter crossroads became sanctuaries, distributing grain, exchanging songs through doorways rather than in plazas. In those rooms, rules of touch were rewritten with kindness, and the city learned the art of surviving smaller. The roads carried less trade and more consolation. A thin thread that still held. Hard years sharpened tempers and narrowed horizons. Palisades once painted with festival colors were newly braced at their gates. Watchtowers learned to count dust plumes at distances they had ignored before. Arguments that had long been handled with belts and speeches began to lean toward embers. A field burned at night becomes a rumor by morning, and rumors assemble in the plaza like soldiers. Yet alliances also tightened, not from fear alone, but from memory of shared labor. The best weapons remained the old ones: grain for a neighbor's hungry winter, timber for a cousin's collapsing roof, the gift that peels a spear from a fist. Some towns failed the test. Others bent, accepted new households into their walls, redrew neighborhoods to make strangers into kin. Smoke rose in both grief and relief, from ruins where a gate had fallen and from kitchens feeding sudden guests. The river watched it all with indifference and kept flowing. Silence also builds, one empty house at a time. Footpaths soften back into grass, door lintels slump, and the plaza's echo loosens until even a shout returns thin. People carry what they can and fold the rest into ritual. Hearthstones are turned, water jars emptied with thanks, a last meal shared on the floor that kept 1,000 earlier meals warm. Then the road receives them. Not everyone walks the same direction. Some follow older memories toward higher springs. Some drift downriver to cities that still hum. Some cross into languages that change the shape of their mouths. Objects become prayers disguised as tools, seeds sewn into belts, songs threaded into lullabies. So children will learn a map without knowing. A place that is left is not erased. It becomes a chapter. Others can open by touch, by the way the wind sifts this corner, and not that, by the sweetness of berries on a mound in late summer. What endures is not only what stands, it is also what travels. Stories paired to their strong bones cross ridges and enter new courtyards, then dress themselves in the local light. Techniques compact to fit into hands, a way to set a post true with 2 stones and a string, a way to fold a roof to drink the winter sun, a way to thank water before cutting a channel. The city's shape dissolves, but its capacities do not. Children learn to read the river again with feet and eyes. Councils shrink to fire circles where decisions can be mended quickly. The long night is not empty. It is patient, teaching endurance in small rooms, asking for kindness that costs. When the sky remembers generosity, new plaster takes shine. Old songs find new verses. A field that had forgotten how to listen to rain turns green. The ground does not keep score. It keeps possibility, waiting for those who will arrive with care. The return does not look like a parade. It looks like a classroom whose map of the world is being redrawn from the center out. It looks like a field day, where children place flags along a buried wall and then race the line as if it were a river. It looks like elders standing with scientists, trading terms until each can speak in the other's cape. The lost city becomes a neighbor again when its stories find daily work. A plaza re-enters memory because a garden takes its shape. A road returns because a path to the bus stop follows its grade. The instruments still hum, but they listen differently now, attuned to voices that already knew what the sensors confirm. The goal shifts from revelation to stewardship, from surprise to care. To learn the old choreography is to promise the ground that steps will be lighter, repairs quicker, and celebrations shared. The archive is no longer a vault. It is a community calendar, and the dates rise from the soil itself. The museum rethinks its voice and starts with a greeting. Cases that once displayed trophies turn into conversations, labels written in more than one language, pronouns chosen with care, origins described as relationships rather than coordinates. Objects that crossed thresholds without consent turn and face the door that will take them back. The building learns new rituals. Collections breathe fresh air before they travel, songs accompany the paperwork, and consent becomes a craft as exact as mount fabrication. Visitors slow down because the rooms are quieter, and in that quiet they can hear the difference between owning and hosting. The past stands taller when it is not fenced by glass alone. It stands tallest when hands that remember shape the way it is seen. Return becomes a verb that changes everyone it touches. The gallery map grows porous, the loan agreements grow humble, and a city's memory takes the front seat on its own terms. Language returns like water finding its old bed. A child forms a word that had waited in a grandparent's mouth for years, and the room changes temperature. Dictionaries grow from kitchen tables. Radio hours carry vowel music across cornfields. Lullabies rebuild grammar while small hands fold dough. Place names reclaim their shapes, the river speaking in sounds that roll like its own current. The work is meticulous and joyful. Recording sessions stack neatly with laughter between them. Spelling choices turn into campfire debates, resolved by the morning's coffee. A language that describes soil and wind with precision teaches better stewardship. And a language that marks kinship with fine detail teaches better politics. When the city rises in words, the old plazas stand up inside the sentences, and the roads reappear as connective particles. The future becomes pronounceable again, and the act of saying it is already the act of making it. Land learns new paperwork when the old stewardship is recognized. Lines on plats bend to follow the forms of hills and marshes that know their own uses. Designations shift from park to protected homeland, from resource to relative. Fire returns on purpose and at the right season, moving with low patience through grass to prune rather than punish. Watersheds gain councils that understand flow as biography. The instruments arrive again, but they serve different masters. Their maps drafted to guard rather than extract. The same roads that once carried trade now carry visitors taught to walk softly and to listen first. The river finds shade where it had lost it, and the fish remember their roots. The field where the plaza slept becomes a place where ceremonies can stand in daylight. Law is asked to keep a promise, and for once, it remembers how. Night gathers like a curtain and reveals rather than hides. Stars arrange their old committee over the valley where the city is breathing again. The new atlas is not a book. It is the way feet find the path in darkness, the way a word takes root in a child's mouth, the way a riverbank grows willow where it was once bare. The lost civilizations were not lost. They were interrupted, misread, and too often silenced. Now the listening is louder than the interruption. The work will not end, because memory is a garden that prefers daily water to grand speeches. Yet the harvest is already here. Laughter tracks along causeways that were once only lines on a scan. A drum beat measures the pace of a treaty fulfilled. Somewhere a seed saved in a belt opens after a century and decides to trust the soil. The city raises its head, not as a monument, but as a promise kept.